Hello, this is Karen from Stitch by Stitch, and we're just starting a new series of chats with industry experts. Our last series was Textile Talk, and we were talking with textile designers and weavers, etc. This time we're going to be talking more with a broader selection of people in the interiors industry about how we can be more sustainable and eco-conscious in the choices of products we choose and finishes that we choose to use. But to kick things off today, I'm going to be talking with Katie Tregarden, who is an author of 4 books. She's a design historian and writer and public speaker, and she's very passionate about sustainability and eco-conscious issues. 2 of the books that she has written in the past were about urban potters, makers in the city, and she wrote another book called Weaving: Contemporary Makers on the Loom, which were really interesting books. And her latest book is called Wasted: When Trash Becomes Treasure. And I'm looking forward to speaking to Katie, and here she is right now. I'm just going to connect her. We had a few little... Hello, Katie, it worked.
Hey.
We had a few little technical issues this morning, but it looks like everything's working just fine.
All right on the night, as they say in show business.
Exactly, yes. So, Katie, I just gave you a little introduction. I told everybody about the books that you'd written about urban potters and weavers, and a little bit of an introduction to your new book, Wasted. But I think perhaps a better introduction would come from you. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Wasted is really, I guess it's the book I've always wanted to write. I think I've been on, I hate to use the word journey, it sounds so X Factor, but I think I've been on a process of discovery, let's say, in trying to work out my purpose, my North Star. I've written about craft and design for the last 10 years, and I've always been very drawn towards purpose-driven craft and design, and where making and thinking about making can do good in the world. I went off to do a master's at Oxford in history of design, and part of the reason for doing that was to try and work out my niche and what I would sort of dedicate the next part of my career to doing. And I just kept coming back to the fact that we have this one huge problem that unless we work it out, none of the rest of it's going to matter. And I think scientists have now said we've got 5 years to halt climate change. So I realized very quickly that it had to be about the environment. And as Robert Kunzig said, waste is the mother of all environmental problems. If you look at waste, it touches every aspect of the environment. So it just it seemed like the moment to write this book. It seemed like a really interesting exploration of materiality and the relationships that we have with materials. And one of the things I look at in the book is that waste isn't a fact, it's a category. So something that's perfectly valuable and useful and wonderful and brilliant 1 minute, something happens and it becomes recategorized as waste. So if we can look at some of the ways in which we're recategorizing waste, we can perhaps stop recategorizing it as waste and recategorize it instead into valuable raw materials. And that's exactly what the designers in this book are doing.
Fantastic. You say that waste is perhaps the biggest environmental problem we have. That to me, that's quite interesting, because not being in this, knowing an awful lot about environmental concerns, particularly apart from, from a layperson's point of view, why do you think waste especially is the biggest problem? Because it seems to me there are so many problems.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily the biggest problem. Robert Kunzig describes it as the mother of all environmental problems. And I think the reason for that is it touches so many issues within the environmental problems. So if you look at the 9 boundaries, which are the boundaries we need to stay within in order to live on Earth sustainably, waste impacts so many of them. So, for example, look at climate change, which is obviously a biggie. If waste were a country, it would be the 3rd largest producer of greenhouse gases after America and China. So, you know, and greenhouse gases obviously affect things like ocean acidification as well. So that's a big issue. If you look at something like biodiversity, which is another one of those 9 planetary boundaries, we waste 1/3 of the food that we produce worldwide, and yet we're still cutting down rainforests and all the beautiful biodiversity within those rainforests to make space for more food production. If you look at something like plastic waste, by 2040, it's predicted that there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. And that's calculated by weight. And most plastic's pretty light. So that's a lot of plastic. And again, that's really impacting the biodiversity in the oceans. So I think the reason that Kunzig said that is just because waste has got its tentacles in so many different environmental problems. So if we can start to look at waste, I think the other thing is we have been following a linear take, make, waste model for 200 years. And that assumes an infinite amount of resources. So we keep taking, we keep making, we keep wasting. And the more we waste, the more we've got to take and the more we've got to make. And there's environmental problems at every point along that process. And it's getting to the stage now where there is more copper in the ash that's left over after we burn waste than there is in traditionally mined copper ore. So our resources are increasingly at the end of that linear process, not at the beginning. We are running out of the helium using MRI scanners, and yet we're still putting it in party balloons. The rare earth metals used in our iPhones, 3 of them are due to run out in the next 10 years.
Gosh.
So increasingly, the things we need are not in the earth, they're in waste. And so we've got to close the loop and move to a more circular economy where we're redefining the outcomes of the linear take, make, waste model into the inputs for something more circular and kind of reclassifying waste as something that's valuable and usable.
Yes, yeah. And recycling, presumably, a lot more of the things that we're not recycling at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with recycling is often there's a lovely diagram where it's sort of the traditional model just goes from the thing to the bin. And then the recycling model, you kind of recycle it a couple of times and then it still goes in the bin, because actually a lot of recycling, you lose quality at every process. There are not many materials that can be recycled infinitely and maintain their integrity. Aluminium and glass are 2 of them, which is why it's so important that we use aluminium and glass rather than plastic. But actually it's about creating systems that don't have any waste in them in the first place. I think 80% of a product's environmental impact is determined at design stage. So it's about rethinking processes so that we just don't have waste, or when inevitable or has already happened. So we've got 200 years since the Industrial Revolution of waste that already exists, finding ways to repurpose it and reuse it, but in a way that can then stay in the circular economy. So one of the questions I always ask designers who are working with waste is, that's brilliant, but what happens when your product becomes waste? You know, can it go back to the circular economy? And sometimes it can't, and sometimes they're at the beginning of the journey and they're still working that out, and that's fine. You know, I really think kind of shaming people for not getting this perfect is not helpful. That's not solutions, but I think it's something that we need to start thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So in your book, you've divided waste into 5, you call them families, which I think is great because it makes it easy for people to understand. What are those 5 families?
So we looked at domestic waste, which is the stuff you and I put in our bins every day. We looked at industrial waste, which is the stuff, or otherwise known as pre-consumer waste. That's all the waste that happens before the products even get to us. And then within those 2 streams, we looked at 3 particularly problematic areas, which are food, fashion, and plastic.
Right.
Now, food, fashion, and plastic waste happens within both domestic and industrial streams. So there's a little bit of a cheat going on there, but it just enabled me to really kind of hone in on the bits that felt most resonant.
Yes. And which of those do you think is well, I think you've already said food, fashion, and plastic are the most problematic to deal with, or the most harmful?
Well, I think they're the most, yes, in some ways, but I think there's a bit of a fudge going on, in that if you think about the phrase reduce, reuse, recycle, which if you grew up in the 90s like I did, kind of got drummed into you from a very young age, right? Sort of 80s and 90s children understand that phrase. Those are all things that consumers are supposed to do, right? We're supposed to reduce our consumption, although nobody ever really focuses on that one. We're supposed to use things,
yeah,
a little bit. Mostly we're supposed to recycle. I came across a horrifying statistic in the book, which is that for every bag of rubbish you or I put out on our doorstep on bin day, 70 bags of rubbish has been generated in making the things that go into that bin.
Right.
So there's been a wonderful shift of responsibility from businesses to consumers. And one of the things I talked to Lucy Siegel about on that episode of my podcast is this idea that we're not consumers, we're citizens. We need to start kind of pushing back. This is not, of course, we must take responsibility for our own waste, and we must recycle, and we must reduce, and we must reuse, we must do all of that stuff. But I think the bigger conversation is about pushing this stuff back upstream.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
Products that can't be recycled. There was a wonderful program on the other day with Hugh Fanley Whittingstall. Sandwich cartons look like they're made of cardboard, but they're lined with plastic. And they say widely recycled on them. They can't be recycled unless you can get that plastic off, which you can't. And so I think the big move now is actually about shifting responsibility back up to the producers and the people who are making the products that are then up in our bins. And I think that's where your 70 bags of rubbish is coming from.
Yeah.
That's real, really move the needle, which is what we've got to do now.
Yes, yeah, that's horrific statistic, isn't it? And I think, well, I would imagine that I'm a fairly typical consumer. I do care and I do my best, and I fish things out of the bin that can be recycled, cardboard, etc. If someone else in the family has accidentally put them in the bin, but we are not really truly educated as to whose responsibility this is. And I also think it's the responsibility of the policymakers, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're very keen to tell us all that we're terrible people because we buy too much and we waste too much. But actually, as you say, it's not just down to the individual. It is a much bigger problem. And we can only do so much as individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important we do. I really believe in personal agency and personal responsibility. And I also think those things can be the starting point for becoming more aware citizens and lobbying government to change. Because as you try to change, you learn things. You learn that those sandwich boxes can't be recycled. And then you write to Sainsbury's and say, why can't they be recycled? And so I think the two things need to happen in tandem. But I do think I think it's time for us to start pushing back up the chain towards government and towards producers, because it's, and it's interesting that even the whole sustainability movement is, buy this keep cup because it's reusable. Do you know what? I've already got 3. I don't need to buy another one. The most sustainable thing you can possibly use is something you already own. Yeah. But it's cool, it's not wrapped in cork or it hasn't got a nice logo on it. And I think, jam jars work really well as reusable coffee cups. I think there's this idea that, we've got to suddenly buy all this new sustainable stuff. And I think Lucy Siegel put it brilliantly on my podcast when she said the kind of recovery from this economic slump we're in now will not come from consumerism. It will come from us being citizens, not consumers. And I think that the sort of constant advertising messages and capitalism and the government telling us we've got to eat out to help out and kind of all this, it's up to us to spend money to solve these problems, and I'm not sure that's where the long-term solutions for the environment lie.
Yes Lucy Siegel's fantastic orator on all of this, isn't she? And actually, can you just tell people about your podcast, because it's fantastic and they might not know about it?
Thank you. Yes, it's called Circular by Design. And Lucy Siegel's one of the guests, as I might have mentioned. Also Hugo Tagholm, who's the CEO of Surfers Against Sewage. Yinka Elori, who's an amazing designer working a lot with waste and reuse. All sorts of people. I tried to get people from every possible So a guy called Anders Zabala, who is what the Guardian have dubbed a zero waste warrior. So he can fit all of his monthly household waste into a single jam jar. And I wanted designers, thinkers, makers, doers, people, kind of all the different angles. And it's basically just me chatting with these people for an hour. No, I think kind of half an hour, 45 minutes in the end we've got each episode down to. There are 9 episodes, and we are dropping episode 5 today, which is with an amazing Danish designer called Nina Tolstrom, who runs Studio Mama. And she's been doing this sort of stuff for a long time. She was really ahead of the curve on this. So she's a really interesting lady to talk to.
Fantastic. Oh, well, that's good timing then. Everybody, download the podcast. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and if you enjoy it, hit subscribe and leave a review, because those are the 2 things that really help more people to find it. So I would be super grateful if everybody could do that.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, we're kind of going down. I mean, it's very difficult to break away from this conversation and to kind of move direction at all, because it's just such a huge subject, and it's a rabbit hole, really, isn't it? But shall we go back to your book and tell us a bit about you've spoken to, I think, 30 designers, makers, craftspeople. Are they a mix of disciplines, or are they all making something?
They're all making or designing something, I would say. Some of them are sort of the thinkers behind the process and then work with craftspeople or manufacturers to get them made. And some of them are more hands-on within the process. I've actually got some preview copies of the book, so I can show you one.
Fantastic. I love the graphics too.
Aren't they? We haven't done a graphic cover before, so it was a bit of a leap, but I love it. And even the book cover is made from waste, and the poly wrap that it comes in, which looks like plastic, so I'm waiting for the social media backlash, is actually not plastic. It's made from a byproduct of the sugar processing industry, and it's entirely plant-based and biodegradable, which is really exciting. But yeah, I spoke to 30 makers, and I, as you said, divided their work into these waste families. So the book starts with a big introduction from me, which sort of contextualizes the problem. And then we've got these 5 chapters. And for each chapter, again, I've written an introduction to that chapter, sort of explaining the problems of this particular waste stream, why it's come about. And then we have 6 designers who are making things from that waste stream and sort of posing a potential solution. And I'm not sort of naive enough to think that the 30 guys in this book are going to single-handedly save the planet. But I think there's a sense that if we can all think the way they're thinking, then we can bring about real change. So just to give you a couple of examples, within the domestic waste chapter, there is an amazing woman called Sana Visser who is using human hair, which interestingly is one of the very few natural resources that is increasing as global population grows, right? And she collects waste hair from hairdressers all over London and turns it into incredibly strong ropes. Hair's got really high tensile strength. And then she's used these ropes to make swings and kind of various things to sort of demonstrate the capabilities of this incredible natural material.
Yeah.
In the industrial waste chapter, there is Granby Ware, which they and I believe to be the first 100% recycled ceramic. So even the binder that is used to hold together the waste is itself waste. And that's a really beautiful product range that they launched on Kickstarter. Within the food chapter, just one example is Bethan Gray's Exploring Eden collection, which she made in collaboration with Nature Squared. And that's using the byproducts of food production, so things like shellfish, feathers from poultry, those sorts of things, to make a beautiful, really high-end, really luxury furniture and accessories collection. And what I think is quite interesting is there's been a shift. So things made from waste used to kind of look like they were made from waste. Whereas people struggle to believe that Bethan's furniture is actually made. They're like, oh yeah, you use the feathers and the shells for inspiration. And she's like, no, those are feathers and shells.
Yeah, amazing. People start thinking, oh, so actually it's not all this kind of slightly earthy, kind of grotty sort of.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. This shouldn't be a compromise. We should be able to live a purposeful and ethical lifestyle that is also beautiful. And I think that's one of the things I try to show in the book. In the fashion chapter, there's an amazing product by a designer called Simone Post, who collaborated with Adidas and used waste trainers, which are almost impossible to recycle because there's so many different materials glued together. And she German company called ICO who just shred them. And then she split the kind of shreds into 2 color palettes and was able to make these really beautiful geometric, really hard wearing rugs that go into Adidas's stores. And she's trying to develop that process to actually make shoes. So she'll have a fully circular product. And then just to give you one example from the plastic chapter, there's an amazing London-based designer called James Shaw who's created this kind of Heath Robinson-esque extrusion gun. And the sweepings off plastic recycling facilities floors go into this gun and get melted down, and this sort of Play-Doh like extrusion comes out the end, and then he actually draws in 3D to create this sort of Baroque inspired furniture, which again is absolutely beautiful and super high end. So yeah, those are just 5 examples of the many brilliant ways these designers are reclassifying waste into something valuable.
Yes, yeah. It's fantastic to think there are that many people actually working on these problems at the moment. I mean, that's quite inspiring, isn't it?
Well, and interestingly, I'm also writing a fortnightly column for Design Milk called Circular by Design, featuring different designers also working with waste. So there are more and more and more, and I'm not running out of people to feature. So that's what I find really inspiring and optimistic, is that for all the kind of genuinely terrifying news around the environment, there are a huge amount of people working really hard to find solutions, and some of them are on quite a big scale, you know, kind of working with big industry to use their waste streams. So there's hope.
Yes, I hope there's hope. Do you think the design colleges are pushing this with the students, or is it the students? I mean, I'm assuming they're all fairly young students who are doing this. I mean, obviously, there's some very established names like Beth and Gray as well. But do you think it's something that the students are being pushed to do, or?
Yeah, increasingly. I think it wasn't the case 10 years ago. It definitely wasn't the case 20 years ago. One of the designers in the book quit her fashion design course because she was told, and I quote, "Fashion is inherently unsustainable, so you needn't bother." But you know, this was a while ago, and now that's changed. And I think now, from the educators I've spoken to on the podcast, one of whom is Sital Solanki, who lectures at the RCA, every brief has to have an element of environmental responsibility, of sustainability, and students can kind of pick what that is, but they can't put anything out in the world when that hasn't been considered anymore. So I do think that's changing. However, I think there are a ton of brilliant, optimistic, talented young designers. They need now to form collaborations with material scientists and big businesses who are generating this waste. And there are platforms where that can happen. There's an amazing example of a group of 20 or so companies in the Netherlands, all of whom are using each other's waste in this beautiful little circle. So one of them has to sterilize something, and the steam that comes off that process is heating something else, and it's this beautiful process. But we need more of that. This has got to be a collaborative solution. I think there's barely a designer in the book who's working on their own, and I think it's about connecting up these people with businesses who are genuinely willing to invest in change.
Yes, and as you say, scientists and as well.
Yeah.
Fantastic. You mentioned in the in your book that you say the makers are interested in the patina of age, which I thought was an interesting phrase. Can you explain that a little bit?
So if you look at the history of design, come the 20th century, there has become a veneration of newness. And you've only got to look at I don't know if you've seen the latest iPhone ad, when they do this almost erotic unboxing of the iPhone, and it's this kind of, you know, the bliss of the new, and the concept of sort of box fresh trainers. You know, the whole unboxing phenomenon on YouTube, where people film themselves opening stuff. New is what we crave right now. And I think what these designers are saying, and the other thing, sorry, I should just mention on the subject of new, 1/3 of young women in Britain consider an outfit old once it's been worn once or twice.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we've moved into an era of disposability. As soon as something is not even damaged or stained or too small, as soon as something has been used, it's lost its allure. And I think what these designers are saying is that actually there is value in something that's old, in something that has seen stuff, has got stories, has got, battle scars. There's a Yinka Ilori, both in the book and on my podcast, talks absolutely inspiringly about a project he worked on at university where he was asked to take two chairs and take them to bits and make one new chair. And he said these two chairs had come from such different backgrounds. One had come from a friend who'd had brushes with the law and sort of lived this slightly dangerous lifestyle. One had come from a pub, so God knows what that chair had seen. Bringing them together and creating a new narrative that had both of those backstories, but also its own story. He said it blew him away. And I think it's that idea that actually something that's old, that's been bumped about a bit and has, heard some things and seen some things, is so much more valuable than something that's shiny and new. And also those things gain value with age. You buy them perhaps second hand, and then you add your stories and your layers, whereas something that is bought because it's new and shiny loses value the second you take it out of the box. And I think that's one of the shifts we've got to see, is a obsession with kind of perfection and newness. And we're starting to see it already. Even if you look at interior design trends, there's more desire for tactile perfection, for something that's handcrafted. And I think all these things play into that shift away from the 20th century veneration of newness.
Yes, yes. It's a strange dichotomy, isn't it? Because on the one hand, we are obviously in a situation now where we do have to think about how we reuse and repurpose everything. But as you say, on the other hand, we all want something that's new, because that's how we've all been brought up, really, is
and I think
what you strive for.
I think we've also got to be careful around the class implications of some of this stuff. I wrote my dissertation on repair and whether the visible mending movement could ever go mainstream. And actually, for a lot of people, wearing something that's old or wearing something that's mended it's not possible because of the job that they do. They've got to be seen in a uniform that's got to be smart, or it's something that just has connotations of poverty that they're just not comfortable with. And so I think we've got to be quite a little bit careful about sitting here from a sort of privileged position and saying everybody must mend and use old things. Not everybody has the time, not everybody has the resources, the skills increasingly are dying out. And I think we've got to be a little bit careful about sort of
yes.
the ability to do some of that stuff.
Yes, it's so complex, isn't it? There's so many layers to it, and problems arising left, right, and centre the more you look into it.
And that's why I'm a big believer in inspiring people rather than shaming them. I think this whole kind of environmental shaming thing is not helpful. It just makes me think, oh, this is too hard, then I'm not even going to try. Whereas I think, if we can share positive stories of people that are doing this brilliantly, then hopefully we can inspire more people to in that gang, as it were.
Yeah, and that sort of comes on to the point you made about changing the culture. Designers can change the culture that we have of needing to always have something new, not sharing things or having things handed down.
I think one of the key tenets of the circular economy is keeping materials and products in use, and I think that's the change that this book is talking about, really. And it's about that moment of reclassification when we sort of say, right, this thing has now become waste. It's just kind of stopping in it and going, well, has it? Because these bananas are a bit brown, but I could freeze them and use them later for a smoothie. Or this top's got a hole in it, maybe I could mend it. Or it's too small for me now, maybe I could give it to somebody. Or I think it's just about that moment when we go to throw something away, thinking, oh, well, maybe actually I don't have to reclassify it as waste. Maybe I can find a different value for it. I've actually just inherited some of my 3-year-old nephew's jeans, which I'm going to use to patch my jeans.
Oh, yes, I do the same with my jeans.
They've gone down through my sister's family and then come back up to me. And I think those things are super important. But I think it's also about the moment of consumption when we buy something, fast forwarding and thinking, am I going to love this and use it, or is it going to end up waste in a week's time, a year's time, 10 years time? But yeah, all of that with the caveat that this ain't all our fault. We've also got to push up to government and businesses and all of those guys to bring about real big change.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it can be quite frustrating as the consumer, can't it? I know recently when we thought we needed a new sofa, and just the idea of, well, what do we do with the old one? What happens to the old one? And it does make you think, what's going, if we buy something new, what's going to happen at the end of that life as well? Do we really, we need to think about that, and
Yeah.
really need something new, or can we recover it or whatever?
Yeah, or buy secondhand. Secondhand furniture is amazing. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
it was so much better made back in the day as it is now. So I think you end up spending a lot less money and getting something for that's a lot better quality, and it's better for the environment. So it's a sort of win-win-win,
yeah.
particularly in furniture. I mean, I'm always amazed when I go to the tip at the pieces of furniture that are just, and you're just like, why have you this? It's a dovetail jointed wooden bookshelf. What is that doing?
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
breaking. I've furnished most of my house with secondhand furniture, and it's a lot cheaper than the big flat pack giants and a lot better made, and it's going to be around for 100 years after I die, I hope.
Yes, yes, yeah, absolutely. So, at the beginning of your book, I believe, you asked the question, can craft save the world? How far down the line answering that question are you, do you think?
Right, so this is the question I set myself halfway through my masters. As I said, I went back to university to study a 2-year masters to kind of work out what my purpose was, and spent the first year exploring all sorts of things. And then in the summer holidays between the first year and the second year, I just thought, I write about craft. Can craft save the world? Now, it sounds like a silly question because we tend to think about craft, grandma's knitted hats and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I really believe it can, and I'm nowhere near done answering that question. There's another 6 books in it, and plenty more podcast episodes, and watch this space for all of that stuff. But I think there's something incredibly powerful in making, and in the thinking that goes around making, the problem solving that designers and craftspeople just do quite inherently and quite naturally. We've talked a little bit about personal agency. If you can make, you can mend. And I think it's really interesting that you talk to someone who can knit and show them a jumper with a hole in, and they will sort that out for you. And also, I think when you can make, you have much more understanding of the value of things. You can look at a piece of clothing and understand the hours and the love that have gone into making that, so you're more likely to mend it. But I also think it's just that problem solving mindset that creative people, designers, craftspeople are blessed with,
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting that a lot of these solutions are coming out of the design industry. They're coming out of other industries as well, for sure. But I think craft skills, we've almost lost. I was interviewing an Indian designer yesterday, and he was saying craft is just so much part of the culture in India. Everybody makes, everybody mends. Your shirt doesn't quite fit, you take it to a tailor, and everybody does. This is not. Whereas, imagine getting a shirt tailored in this country. That is serious serve of the rich, right?
It's considered, beyond.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Craft to a certain extent become art. We buy beautifully crafted objects and we put them on a plinth with a top light. A bowl of eating out of, or for keeping things in. And I think there's a slight disconnect in this country with just the kind of very tangible making and mending, and Glenn Adamson talks brilliantly in his book The Invention of Craft that craft was only invented with the Industrial Revolution, because before that we just made it wasn't craft. It was us solving a problem with our hands. And I think, in some ways, if you can think with your hands, you can solve problems in a very different way. And I think it's that hand knowledge as well as the head knowledge, and the combination of those two things that will hopefully get us out of this mess, because we really don't belong.
Yes, yes. And it's very sad, isn't it, to think that art and design education in school is being kind of beaten out of the system.
Yeah.
When actually, I think, particularly at this particular time with COVID, we really need to be thinking creatively. And because the powers that be are not thinking creatively, this is partly why we are in such a mess at the moment, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I do some work with a social enterprise called the Make Bank, which is all about supporting kids in creative poverty. So, you know, obviously we hear a lot about food banks and kind of beauty banks providing toiletries to families who can afford them, but this is about providing creative equipment. So a lot of kids can't study creative subjects at school because they can't afford the materials. Kids have to pay for that stuff themselves now. When I was at school, school provided that. That's not happening anymore. So the Make Bank is all about getting these kits out to these kids. And they've been doing a lot of work in COVID to get these kits out to kids who are obviously being home educated, and kind of finding it harder to keep up with the creative subjects than the other subjects because of that need for materials. That is a brilliant initiative. And one that's well worth supporting as a sort of slightly more tangential environmental move, but I think it's all connected.
Yeah. I'm kind of hoping, in an optimistic way, I tried to be optimistic generally, that this crisis that we're in, this COVID crisis, may actually mean that we step back and think hard about the environment. I mean, you know, we've only got to listen to any scientist talking about biodiversity and how, you know, if you start messing with it, then you get viruses that we can't control, etc. Do you think that generally people are moving into more of a kind of, are they thinking more about the environment and caring more about their waste and what we can do?
I think so. It's really interesting that research shows that the more time people spend, the more they care about the environment. And, you know, obviously I'm very privileged. I live in Cornwall. I'm surrounded by beautiful nature, but by nature, you know, this could be growing tomatoes on the balcony. It's not necessarily, you know, the great wilds. And I think lockdown gave some people the chance to do that. Again, I think we've got to be very careful that some people were still working and, you know, putting their lives at risk to get workers to work and work in hospitals and all that stuff. But for some of us, it was an opportunity to spend more time in nature and reflect on the human cost of the modern way of life. And I've just read an incredible book called Humankind, which is about this idea that there has been a theory that's perpetuated for a long time that civility is just here and underneath we're all brutes. And he slowly takes this theory apart. And it's interesting that at the beginning of lockdown, we all thought there'd be looting and, you know, kind of fighting. And actually what happened is people volunteered to check on their neighbours. I go and collect a prescription for an 80-year-old lady in my village. You know, we gave
amazing.
Our 90-year-old next door neighbour. That's what happened. People were, and I think what makes the news tends to be what's exceptional. And so we're seeing all this kind of awful behaviour and people littering and people on the beaches in Margate and all of this stuff. But most people are good. Most people are staying in. Most people are staying within their bubbles of six or whatever the ladies call it. You know, most people are doing this right. And I think most people, there was an article in The Guardian this morning that said that 65% of people want the government to seriously look at the impact that fashion is having on the environment. So whilst we see the queues outside Primark the day they open after lockdown on the news, 5% of the British population don't want that.
No.
You know, I think we've got to be really careful about the stuff that's in the news and the stuff that's in the headlines and the stuff the government, you know, are putting out, versus actually holding on to that optimism and that hope that we can bring about change and employing our own personal agency to look after, you know, the impact of our own lifestyles, but also writing to supermarkets, writing to MPs, kind of using our kind of vote well when it comes to elections. And I know the American elections are upcoming, so if any Americans are listening, please register to vote and please vote. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, it's not my place, but go vote. I think we have to use the power that we've got, and we've got more power than we realise, I think, often to affect some of this stuff. I think the media can make us feel very powerful. But
I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's very negative, and it saps all your optimism and your energy for change and good thing.
Yeah, but ultimately it's exceptional. That's why it makes headlines. It's not the day to day. And we've just got to
Yeah. Oh, Katie, it's been fantastic talking to you. We've gone on and on for 45 minutes. I mean, it's a shame to stop really, but it's been really interesting, and I will put the details of your book in the notes on the IGTV and also your fantastic podcast. But if shall we just have a very quick look and see if there are any burning questions? I think there were a couple of questions.
Job and say that the book is available to pre-order now and in independent bookshops from the 8th of October.
And Calma Interior Decor, it's called Wasted. Trash, when trash becomes treasure.
Yes, that's exactly it. And pre-orders are super important for kind of getting up the algorithms and getting onto bestseller lists and getting this message out to as many people as possible. So
yeah, all these sort of things that you really realise are going on in the background. I've had a question from an interior designer I know quite well called Natalie Bourne. She says, where do you see as the real areas that are setting the blueprint for recategorizing waste, versus what area is not anywhere near where they need to be? So where do you think things are, the success stories, I think she means?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody's anywhere near where they need to be honest. The circular economy is still a tiny part of the economy, and most of the world is still trotting along on take, make, waste. So yeah, we've got a lot of work to do. From an interior design perspective, I think it's really interesting that adaptive reuse in architecture is often not seen as cool, as special, as talented as kind of new builds. And I think that's an area that we can really look at, and working out how to take buildings that exist and spaces that exist and repurpose them rather than always knocking down and starting again.
That would be very timely too, isn't it, with rethinking our cities possibly?
Yeah, absolutely. And the construction industry is one of the biggest culprits in terms of waste. A third of the materials that turn up on site, or the amount of waste that comes off a construction site, is equivalent to 1/3 of the materials that turn up on site, regardless of the fact that about 90% could be recycled. And in countries like Germany and the Netherlands, the figures are being hit. And I think in interior design, we've talked a little bit about secondhand furniture, and I think that's a huge area. There's a real move in interior design away from these kind of minimalist environments that were sort of popular in the 90s and the sort of kind of super cool Google-esque workspace of the early 2000s, towards something with more patina, texture, with more age. And I think secondhand furniture is a brilliant way of bringing some of that stuff into a space. Yeah. And as we're redefining workspaces as we come out of COVID, people can work from home now, so why would they come to work? Well, a lot of they will come to work is for a sense of connection and culture and community, and the spaces that will support that need that patina and that age, that kind of that coziness, and I think secondhand materials can be really valuable there. So it's not necessarily all about innovative new materials made from kind of obscure waste streams. Some of it is as simple as sourcing a secondhand table for the boardroom,
just simple little changes, cultural changes. Okay, I don't think there were any other burning questions. We had loads of people join, which was fantastic. So I think I will put the name of the book and the podcast and all those things in the notes. And thank you once again, Katie, for coming on and talking to us about this. Really interesting, and I hope the book does really well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
No problem. Thanks, Katie. Bye, everyone.
Bye.